we have Jonathan Calkins, a new arrival to the panel, who is professor at the Heinz College at Carnegie Mellon University. We have Rob Kampla, executive director of the Marijuana Policy Project, and Kevin Sabet, director of the Drug Policy Institute at the University of Florida, and president and CEO of SAM. So we have people representing a pretty wide range of perspectives on the legalization question, and I just want to kind of get in immediately. Now, one thing that is certainly true is that there is no one on the panel right now who believes that the status quo around marijuana is working. So just to start, I wonder if, Kevin, you can kick us off and tell us what is the most urgent problem? What is the thing that you think is just, that you most want to see changed about the status quo around marijuana policy?
Thank you, Reihan, and I appreciate the question. Actually, we just had an entire panel on this, which was, I think, ended up turning out very well on the different shades of decriminalization. It's a term I don't love to use because it means a lot of things to a lot of people, but we sort of defined it for those purposes as meaning, how can we change elements of on the demand side versus the supply side. Now, legalization deals with the supply side, but how can we change elements of the demand side? And just getting definitions right is very important. I mean, most of the world, I think, thinks that Portugal has legalized drugs, which they haven't. Folks think that, our prisons in the U.S. even are full of people whose only offense is marijuana, which they're not. So I think there are a lot of myths around that. Look, I think...
So Kevin, just to be clear, so you see the most urgent problem being, is it, over-punishment? Is it kind of excessive? Is it, just to kind of really be clear about that, what do you see as the most urgent problem with the status quo?
Yeah, look, I think that obviously in certain places, whether it's in this country or in Russia or other countries, there's been an overzealousness in enforcing the law and giving people criminal records in this day of the internet where you can find anyone's background to hurt them in the future. And so we've obviously in some places gone overboard, and I'd like to change that. The status quo, though, is different in Colorado, Washington, and a couple of other states in the U.S. than it is in the rest of the country. So it matters where we're talking about first.
Got it. Rob, I imagine you have a different perspective on what is the most urgent problem with the status quo around marijuana policy.
Yeah, I would say that the two areas that are in most urgent need of being addressed are the number of people getting sucked into the criminal justice system, right? So you're talking about 700,000 people who are being arrested a year for marijuana, 89% are for simple possession. We need to end that churning machine that keeps cranking people through the criminal justice system year after year after year, and obviously it disproportionately affects young people and racial minorities. So one is criminal justice reform, and two is for folks who actually need to use marijuana for medical purposes, they should be able to have access to it, because there are many folks, including some folks that I work quite closely with, whose need is so great they're willing to go through almost any measures to obtain marijuana for medical purposes, and for some folks it's actually a matter of life and death. So I would call that a humanitarian crisis.
Lisa, you work in Mexico, and you also do a lot of comparative work studying regimes around narcotics throughout Latin America and the world. But I wonder, just focusing on the U.S. for a moment, what do you see as the biggest problem caused by the kind of current legal regime around marijuana in the United States for the kind of wider world?
Well, for the United States, first of all, let me just say thank you to the organizers for including women in the panel, and a woman coming from other countries that is not the U.S. Because I believe that there are many women involved in drug policy, and gender, you're going to see it at the UNGAS this week, gender is one of the big issues here, because women get particularly criminalized by drug laws. Second, coming back to the debate in the US, I think that you guys have a punishment problem rather than having a drug problem. You do have a drug problem, though, but it's bigger, in my humble opinion, the problem that you have criminalizing and punishing unnecessarily, as Kevin said, for minor offenses most of the times. But coming from Mexico, the international perspective cannot escape me. And one of the main problems of the US is that you have tried for many, many decades to impose that same view that you had in the domestic level to other countries, and that created a massive political problem elsewhere, in which countries like mine totally buy the idea that being tougher on supply side and on the demand side was going to solve the drug problem in the end, and it didn't, and it created loads of other problems. So I would say domestically you have a punishing problem, and internationally you have a leadership one, because for many years you lead the wrong battle, and now you're trying to correct the wrongs domestically, but you're not providing necessarily the space for other countries to do so as well.
So Lisa, part of what you're saying is that we have taken a domestic regime around regulating narcotics and tried to impose it elsewhere.
You have exported effectively, yes.
Jonathan, tell us about what you see. Now, we've heard, all three panelists so far have talked about punishment and excessive punishment as part of the problem. But I wonder if there's anything else on the horizon that you see. And also, just briefly, I'd like to point out that our organizers feel so strongly about representation that, Jonathan actually is subbing in for Sue Rushy, who is a kind of, fantastic, thoughtful woman who's done a lot of kind of advocacy and journalism and much else around this issue. But Jonathan is a man who contains multitudes, so thankfully he's going to represent a lot here on this panel today. Please.
Well, I guess I'll also single out punishment, but I have a very different view of this than the way Rob expresses it. It's just false that 700,000 people get sucked into the criminal justice system every year by marijuana offenses. Precisely because the marijuana arrests are concentrated in people who are already interacting with the criminal justice system a lot. We should not have the image that it's just a regular user who gets arrested and convicted, let alone incarcerated for their possession alone. This is piling on additional arrests on people who are already interacting with the criminal justice system. But what should we do? Number one, close the criminal record after 2 years so that it doesn't block employment. That's easy to do. And number two is to not have marijuana possession compromise community release for people on probation and parole. That's the real way that marijuana increases incarceration. Not users getting incarcerated, but people who are robbers on probation or parole after being convicted for robbery, having the probation or parole revoked because of marijuana violation. That's the real problem.
So, very broadly speaking, I think it's fair to say that Jonathan and Kevin, you both believe that, while you don't believe that the status quo is ideal, you do believe that having some pretty stringent controls around marijuana is important and valuable. That's been a losing proposition recently. It's been particularly in the kind of political debate over time, we've seen a pretty dramatic shift in public opinion. So, Kevin, I wonder, do you have some theory as to why you've had this dramatic sea change in public opinion, particularly among younger people? Is it just that people have been badly misled, or is it that people are seeing something that kind of is real about the flaws in the status quo? I'm just curious as to your sense of why we see this dramatic change in public opinion.
I think there's been a huge misunderstanding about the potential harms from marijuana driven by an industry that wants to get rich. And it's the same kind of industry we've had with tobacco, it's the same kind of industry we've had with alcohol, it's the same kind of industry that went into Appalachia and West Virginia 15 years ago and introduced OxyContin to poor white populations working in the mines. I mean, it's, you go after vulnerable populations, in this case I think young people, who are absolutely getting misled by an industry that says things like, marijuana is natural. I have, speaking in front of a lot of kids, and they'll often say to me, well, Kevin, marijuana is natural, so how can it be bad for you? And I have to remind them that poison ivy is natural too. But the misinformation out there, I had someone else recently say to me that, Kevin, I know marijuana isn't addictive. And he was a 15-year-old boy, and I said, well, how do you know that? And he said, well, because I use it every day. So I can speak with authority. And so this kind of misinformation that's out there is being pushed by an industry who only makes money when there's brand loyalty, and you have to start young, and only makes money among, as we heard earlier from John, and we've heard from so many others, there are heavy users and heavier users who are using it responsibly. And so I think that that's actually a huge challenge with what we have right now, is the amount of misinformation and the gap between the conference of the American Medical Association, the conference of the World Health Organization, and what you see in discussed either in school assemblies or among high school students or in a lot of other conferences.
Well, Rob, you've been a leading advocate in state after state of pretty significant changes in the regulation of marijuana, and I wonder how you feel about that. Just the sense that it's really an industry behind this. Is that your view, or do you think that there's been something else at work in this shift in public opinion?
the role of the industry is actually a lot smaller than a lot of people might imagine, and we touched on that briefly at the panel in this room an hour ago. So if you actually look at where the money's coming from, where the ideas are coming from with regard to passing these laws, it's overwhelming that the money comes actually from traditional philanthropists, people who are members of the Marijuana Policy Project, just like they might be members of a gun rights group or the ACLU or another organization. Last year, 10% of our revenues came from the industry, and in Colorado, when we legalized there in 2012, 5% of the money from the Colorado campaign came from the industry. So it's not a big number. However, I don't actually care what the number is. It doesn't matter to me whether 5% of our revenues come from the industry, 25%, 50%. It doesn't really matter. What really matters is making sure that we're writing laws to roll back and end prohibition and to regulate marijuana similarly to alcohol. And when we talk about marijuana companies marketing to people, and specifically young people, to get them interested in marijuana when they're young, the fact of the matter is that under the prohibition regime that's existed for decades, young people are already using marijuana at young ages, and then some of them stay with it and some of them don't. So the young people using marijuana is nothing new. And also for those who are on the prohibition side of life, I would wonder, are they really going to become legalizers if we had a ban on all advertising, or would they still, in fact, maintain their position in favor of prohibition?
Well, Lisa, I wonder, we've seen this dramatic shift in public opinion in the United States. Tell us a bit about public opinion elsewhere in the Americas, if we've seen parallel changes. My understanding is that cannabis consumption in the US and Canada is quite a bit higher than it is in Latin America more broadly, though I also imagine that there's been some change in consumption patterns over time. So can you give us a bit of comparative context?
Yeah, well, I will speak for the Latin American region. That's where I have more contact with people on the ground. Effectively, in Latin America, consumption is not as high, although it's it's rapidly increasing. Particularly in some countries in the south, like Chile, you start having a lot more of consumption, and in Brazil, it's starting to become also a pool of cocaine consumption.
What's been going on? What's contributed to the increase?
Well, increase in income, particularly it's related to people have more money to do so. The middle class is growing. You also have availability because we're producing countries, but it's also cultural. I believe that there's a change in perceptions, and there are many other drugs being available, but we don't necessarily have a consumption issue. In Mexico, if you actually go to the numbers, you have around 600,000 people that are addicted to all illegal drugs in a country of 112 million people. It's not necessarily that problem, and that is not to say that from the health perspective we need to invest a lot more into informing, educating. It's not only information, it's about educating in more long life-term interventions and integrating services. For example, in Latin America, it's just a mess. We have very little availability of science-based treatment facilities and so on and so forth. But in terms of public opinion, given that our problem is not necessarily how do we relate to drugs and how do we misuse drugs, public opinion remains opposed to legal regulation, also mainly because of information. There have been active campaigns as to portray drugs as the evil, and active campaigns also as to say that we do need to, go harsher on drugs, and that kind of rhetoric is being used actively by politicians as to justify other ends of such policy that has nothing to do with drugs most of the times. So in Mexico, for example, what we saw is that in order to tackle security issues, but also political issues, we made drugs the main issue during President Calderon's government, and we started passing laws that were beyond drugs, and the justification on we're doing this because we need to be, very frontal with the cartels, and we need to be very strong on sending this message that it's totally unacceptable that our kids are using. We're going to take the military out in the streets, and we're going to do this and do that, and passing constitutional amendments as to have a more securitized legal context. And that's happening in Argentina at the moment with Macri now being president, has happened in Brazil, it has happened all across Latin America. But that's also changing, and that's interesting to notice, because all of the developments here in the US, also because the Canadian government just announced that they're going for legal regulation of cannabis as well, and because of the dissemination of all of this information on decrim experiences elsewhere in the world, and the harm reduction speech coming from Europe, and some other places, public opinion is starting to believe now that drugs are a public health issue and not just a crime-related topic that we need to use the criminal justice system to fight with.
I want to be sure to get back to Jonathan, but briefly, Lisa just mentioned Canada and the new Canadian government moving in this sharply different direction. And Kevin, I have to ask you, just what kind of effect might that have? Because of course, Canada is often looked to by many Americans as a model of public policy reform. The fact that it's so close to home. Do you fear that, for people who advocate, your own perspective on the legalization issue, that Canada moving this direction might prove challenging?
Well, I think they've had some issues rolling it out, and we'll see how long it takes. Uruguay also did. I mean, they spent more than $1 million in a public campaign to change the opposition to get it from 70% below 50, and I think it's still hovering around 60. I think Lisa makes a good point about public opinion on this and the rest of the world being decidedly against. I think in Canada, I mean, sure, of course it's going to have implications, but we're going to have to see whether and how it gets rolled out. I worry that when people are talking about in Canada, let's look at the alcohol model, or even the not-for-profit alcohol model in Canada, because that has still produced some, for those that follow public health issues in Canada, some really devastating outcomes in public health, even if they don't have as much of a commercial market as the U.S. does.
Jonathan, you have, I'd say that if I were to characterize your views on this broad set of questions, the big thing is just caution. Let's move slowly, let's think hard about the design of these regimes. Yet, when you're looking at the change in opinion, I would say that, you've seen populist movements, and actually precisely the work that Rob has done has been really grassroots driven. Yes, I'm sure industry plays some role, but there's been a lot of grassroots energy, and you've seen it through initiatives, you've seen it through the creation of lots of regimes, legal regimes in the States that, are frankly pretty kludgy a lot of the time, that are not always, incredibly thoughtful and well designed. Why have the people who've been advancing your position done such a bad job of persuading the public? Or maybe that's an unfair characterization, but if it is, let me know.
Yeah, I'll try to answer almost that. I'm not sure why they've done a bad job of persuading, but I think there are two serious misunderstandings amongst a lot of folks who are in favor of legalization. And the first version of this misunderstanding is legalization means nothing changes except people stop getting arrested. And that's extraordinarily naive. Once the industry is legal, all sorts of things about the industry's structure, size, practices, products that are put in the market, they're going to change. So I think one source of the enthusiasm for legalization is a fundamental misunderstanding of how much will change after legalization. And the second, sort of related, is almost anybody can design a legalization regime that beats the current prohibition. That's not the question. The question is, what's the legalization regime we're going to get? It'd be easy to design a good legalization regime, but it'd also be really easy to design a much better prohibition regime. So it's not fair to compare a perfect legalization regime to the actual prohibition regime. You got to compare what we will actually get under legalization, and I fear that it will be much less public health oriented than the ideals brought on academic talk work.
If I can also just chime in, I think also, Reihan, you're implying this sort of inevitability that came up this morning. And yes, obviously, public opinion has changed. We can all admit that that's happened, and that there's been changes in policies over several states. But also, it's sort of like having a lot of wins when your opponent is basically forfeited. The power of money in politics to move the campaigns in these different states has been enormous. And in fact, the last campaign, which was in Ohio, because there was a lot of free media given to the idea that this is a monopoly in Ohio, it lost 2-1. The closest opposition campaign that had even, not 4 zeros of difference, but maybe just 2 zeros of difference, was, obviously I get that it's 100 years ago, it might as well be, was California in 2010. But all the other initiatives, there haven't been the billionaires bankrolling them. I mean, I say that with envy, Rob. I mean, we just haven't had, Peter Lewis or George Soros or John Sperling say, here's a check, go find these states. These are, Washington State was, for all the, and I disagree with her, Allison did a great job. For all of that, there was virtually no opposition, and in Colorado, very little opposition. And so, I think we can't forget that also.
Can I just jump in with the example of Mexico again to take us a little bit out of the US dynamics as well? We talk a lot of the role of the industry here, but oftentimes when we're analyzing prohibition and the consequences, we don't speak about the industries that benefit from prohibition in our countries. You're talking about a ministry in my country that it was about to get extinguished. La Marina, the Navy was supposed to be extinguished. And with the declaration of let's fight this, using the military, let's go harsher on crime and whatnot, its budget increased 600% over 5 years. There is absolutely no interest from that particular industry into getting involved in the policy innovations debate. And public opinion is also very sensitive about that. We saw it after the Supreme Court in Mexico ruled that the general health law that we have, it was unconstitutional because it was too intrusive of people's lives, regardless that the state had the right and the legitimacy to actually protect public health by trying to inhibit cannabis consumption. When the legal argument went out, and when the justices came to the media and explained to the people what was the rationale behind that ruling, we got an increase of 8 points in the number of people that were in favor of innovating.
Yeah, but that's different than legalization.
And it's legal regulation. And it's legal regulation because the justices said it's not about just legalizing. Legalizing is a thing that you do overnight. It's just a change in the law. You change a word. What comes after is what's really important, and there are many ways of regulating a market, and it doesn't have to be just the big marijuana or the way the US have done it. I think we will see eventually in other parts of the world other efforts to try and control it better from the state with less participation of private actors, and it might also be a naive idea to say that public institutions are going to do it better than private. I do agree that legal regulation has its risks, but let's not forget to say, the complete story of all of the time. If there are private interests behind the campaigning in favor, there are also many interests, private and public, in favor of keeping status quo as it is.
So I wonder, Rob, the opposition to legalization these days tends to take a kind of public health perspective. They tend to emphasize the potential dangers, particularly the dangers to young people, etc. Yet my sense is that your advocacy of legalization is really rooted in a belief in personal freedom. So I wonder, do you believe that these public health concerns are legitimate? That's one question. And another question, and it's kind of related to some of what we've been talking about. So, one view is that we have this pluralism that's coming from very different kinds of state regimes, and that, there might be some regimes that are actually not working all that well. Do you see that as okay, as part of the kind of trial and error evolutionary process, and it's actually just fine to have that kind of pluralism? Or do you worry about legalization happening in ways that might actually discredit the cause of legalization? I know those are two very different questions, but please do with them as you will.
I'll try to explain as best I can. If you want to hear more, please ask. So we talked, you mentioned earlier, Jonathan, about how when we talk about legalization, it's not just about removing people from the criminal justice system, but there's a whole bunch of other implications, and I agree. So the motivation behind what we do is not just about us having some adherence to the notion of personal freedom or personal liberty, but it is also about public health. So right now under prohibition, you have a situation where, by definition, it's trying to restrict freedom. It's trying to restrict adults from using a substance that's actually safer than alcohol. So it is about repressing freedom. And then also under prohibition, you have a whole host of collateral sanctions. Yes, of course, there's arrest and jail, but there's also other things, such as the loss of a driver's license in many states. If you lose your driver's license, that is almost the equivalent of losing a job. And then there's other collateral sanctions, such as the loss of the ability to adopt a child or to serve as a foster parent, the loss of access to student loans. It's on your record, so you might not get the job that you want. There's a whole litany of sanctions in addition to the handcuffs and the jail.
Those are things that Jonathan's proposal would address.
And then under legalization, going to public health, one of the advantages of legalization is that, and you're seeing this in Colorado and elsewhere, is that the marijuana that you purchase is actually labeled, and testing is actually happening. Sometimes it's not tested in the exact way we want, but the intent is to ultimately have all the marijuana that's being sold at the retail level to be labeled properly, not only in terms of making sure that people know how potent it is and what the origin of the marijuana is, but also knowing that it's free from pesticides and really knowing what you get. And that is clearly an advantage to what the prohibition system has to offer, which is you buy marijuana from a drug dealer, you don't know the potency, you don't know if it's laced with something, etc. So there's so many advantages to legalization that it's not even a close call.
Well, but it's also true that legalization, or at least kind of one argument, is that if we were to have a world with full commercial legalization, that the price of cannabis would collapse, and that this might in turn lead to a dramatic increase in consumption. Do you disagree with that? Do you think that that's not in fact the case? That if you had well, first of all, that you would have a huge fall in prices, and that if you had a huge fall in prices, that it would lead to an increase in consumption?
So it's kind of too soon to tell with the experiment in the US, because Colorado, which was the first out of the gate, started selling at the retail level on January 1st of 2014, so we've only had 26 months. But the minimal government data that are available indicate that the usage rates really haven't changed all that much, not only for people under the age of 21, but people over the age of 21. So there's maybe little blips on the radar, but it's not a big deal. Now, if the price drops dramatically, one would assume that usage rates would go up some. I mean, that sort of makes intuitive sense that any economist would probably agree with. But if usage rates do go up some, you have to question how bad is that for society compared to the alternative, which is prohibition. And so all this has to be balanced out.
Jonathan, can you walk us through that a little bit? Just your understanding of what might happen in this theoretical world of full commercial legalization to prices and what effect that might have on consumption?
Sure. After legalization at the national level, so anybody can produce, marijuana, the plant, can be grown by farmers who are also good at growing tomatoes and cucumbers. So just use some of those numbers. 600 pounds can be grown per acre of dried flowering buds, and another 2,000 pounds of other material you can extract THC from. The usual price for a sort of a complicated plant that requires transplanting is about $5,000 to $20,000 an acre. Let's choose 12 because it makes arithmetic easy. 12,000 divided by 600, $20 a pound production cost. Current farm-based prices are $2,000 a pound. The numbers are a little different if you do it in the greenhouse, and greenhouse may be where most of it is going to happen. But the cannabis plant is an amazing plant in terms of the ability to supply daily use with a small number of square feet of growing area. So the farming, the production, is going to become extraordinarily cheap and stop being the essential part of the companies. It's like the production cost of the water in this bottle of water. It's not that this was free at the grocery store, but the cost of producing the water inside the bottle is not what drives the economics of the bottled water industry. And in our book, we even point out that, look at water, you can spend a lot per ounce, you can get it very cheap out of your tap, and you can even get it free. I didn't pay for that when it was comped to me. After legalization, that'll probably be the way that marijuana is. There will be high-end, boutique, organically grown, sold to college grads. It's every bit as expensive as it is now. There will be cheap Budweiser, common market version stuff that is going to serve the bulk of the intoxication. And honestly, it's not at all impossible to imagine you could actually be comped marijuana because it will be so cheap compared to its value to users. Who knows? You check into a hotel room, you sit down at a table at a restaurant, there will be no cost-based reason why you couldn't even be comped marijuana. So I think you're going to see multiple different levels of pricing, but the most of the market is a Walmart market, not a Whole Foods market. More than 50% of it is consumed by people with a high school education and below. They are price sensitive. The bulk of the intoxication is going to be sold at a fairly low price.
Well, just another quick follow-up. So if we're looking at the legal regimes that have emerged in Colorado and Washington, my sense is that because federal law makes it so difficult for growers and what have you, we're not necessarily seeing a full test case of what full commercial legalization would look like in those states. Is that
Absolutely correct. Concrete example is still an awful lot of it is grown under artificial lights. Very few of the cucumbers.
and under very unfavorable tax provisions, right?
Absolutely, that also. But yeah, very few of the cucumbers that you eat are grown under artificial lights. There are many, many ways in which this industry is still like the aviation industry 2 years after Orwell and Wilbur Wright. There will be a very big difference after, say, 10 years after national legalization. You'll see completely different modes of production and marketing than we're seeing just 2 years ago.
Well, Kevin, one argument that proponents of legalization often make is that if we look at alcohol, alcohol is enormously destructive. It is highly addictive. Its use is very, very pervasive. And yet, we have decided that the harms associated with banning it far outweigh the harms associated with allowing it to be available, in some regulated fashion. So I wonder, number one, do you believe that alcohol is underregulated? And number two, are there any other flaws that you see with that analogy to alcohol?
Well, I think anyone with a pulse who doesn't get a check from the alcohol industry would say that there is an underregulation right now of alcohol, that the widespread promotion of alcohol and commercialization is pretty absurd, and that they make a lot more money than they probably should in this country. But there's one reason why it's not legal for adults over 21. It has nothing to do with the harms. I mean, if we were looking at it from a public health perspective, there's no debate about the public health harms of alcohol. If we were solely looking at it from sort of the costs and benefits from a public health perspective, but we have to also look at it from a cultural and historical perspective. This is a drug, alcohol, used by, for the last 200 years, at least 70% of Americans, but probably 70% of the West since before the Old Testament. Doesn't mean that cannabis hasn't been used for thousands of years also, but we're at 9% right now regular use in this country. We're not at 70% use. In my mind, that's why one is illegal and one's legal. I mean, if we were talking about a drug now with cannabis that was used regularly by 70% of the population, okay, I admit we would have to be having a different conversation. We're not quite there yet. I would say, obviously I'm not going to go through the stats, but when you look at Colorado, for the last 26 months, you also have to look not only the last 26 months, but really since they started full-scale commercialization and availability, which was around 2009, when they had an explosion of marijuana stores. If you were 18 or over with a headache, you could get marijuana. So that started not in 2014, but in 2009. And we never had 5-year-olds poisoning from going to the emergency room from edibles before 2009. Not one case. We didn't have the deaths that we've seen. Talk to Levi Thumba's uncle from the Congo, who we've talked to about the deaths related to marijuana. So I'm not saying, I don't think anyone's saying the sky is falling, or we know now whether definitively this has been a public health success or failure. But I think we're in denial when we, don't admit the fact that industry is in full control of the driver's seat. We just had a debate in Colorado last week. We wanted to cap in some places THC at between 15 and 20%. Yes, there will be a black market for the shatter and for the BHO 98% potency. But we thought at least having a cap in some stores would be a good idea. Shot down by the industry. We wanted to make sure in Washington State that the tax money that they had promised for prevention and education and treatment, that was the campaign slogan. Money will go to prevention and education. We wanted to say, all right, well, this money's there, let's do that. We lost because it all went to the general fund and because the industry was there. We wanted to have a conversation about limiting the stores in Colorado. There are something like 3 or 4 times as many stores in poorer neighborhoods in Colorado, marijuana stores, than in upper-class white neighborhoods. We wanted to limit that. We were stopped because of the industry. And if anyone has read, my final point, the initiatives that people are voting on in November of 2016, if you haven't read it, and you still control, please read it. Because you will see that in Nevada, if you are growing marijuana, home cultivation, and you live within 25 miles of a store, you will be criminalized.
Oh, hold on.
And in Arizona and Massachusetts, almost the majority of people who get to create the rules for cannabis in those states have to come from the industry. These have all been written for industry.
I want to bring Lisa in here. So we're talking about some of the harms that are done by these new legal regimes, but it's also true, or it seems to be true, that criminalization has also led to significant harms, and my understanding is that it may well have contributed to the emergence of very formidable, very dangerous criminal organizations. So I wonder if this is, kind of for better or for worse, this is oftentimes the way that people think about the kind of international dimension of the legalization debate. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, in particularly Mexico and Colombia, there has been a lot of discussion on whether prohibition has created the biggest challenge in terms of transnational organized crime, which is illegal drug trafficking, and how powerful those cartels are, and how threatening they can be in terms of challenging even the rule of law and the capacity of a state to control its own territory and the legitimate monopoly of violence and whatnot. We in Mexico, we don't talk necessarily just about cannabis legalization, and that is a point that I want to make. Here in the US, you apparently have a conversation of cannabis legalization that I fully agree with. I need to say this, I am for legal regulation. But I think that in many other countries in which we have the problem of production and transit, we're talking about a broader discussion that is drug policy reform in general. And that, of course, touches on security, and that touches on the criminal justice system and policing, and touches on violence reduction and public health, and a lot of other issues and a lot of other substances, not just cannabis. The reason why we are engaged in the cannabis discussion in Mexico is because we do have a similar problem in the sense that we're unnecessarily and dramatically increasing the criminalization of people who use drugs, in particular the cannabis. The service that we have of people in federal prisons for drug-related felonies or crimes are just outrageous. Like 50% of people are there for drug-related offenses are there for possession of cannabis, simple possession with no intention to sell, of quantities that are less than $50. So we do have that particular discussion because of that, but also because it has created this strategy of the government of being tough on crime and particularly targeting the organizations dedicated to illicit trafficking has created even more violence. So to us, drug policy reform is also needed as a way to reduce violence. But that is not to say that we believe that cannabis legalization will immediately solve the homicides epidemic. It's not necessarily going to solve the entire organized crime agenda, but legal regulation can solve a lot of problems that are directly related to prohibition and the way our laws are designed in criminalizing and targeting the wrong groups. Because if we are being super tough on crime and we have, like all of our military forces on the streets going after the criminals, but our prisons are only filled with people that were non-violent, most of the times first offenders, that were not charged with other felony or crime as it can be in the US. They were not charged for robbery, they were not charged for murder, they were charged for simple possession. It might be that the police forces are doing a terrible work and just filling whatever they want to fill in the forms and then arresting people for many other things. But we need to solve those particular problems, and we need to take it as a step to a more comprehensive reform of our drug policies for all drugs. And I will close with just one comment. Legal regulation in Mexico, it's also being looked after politicians, because we need to do something with our producers. It's not only that we are engaged in this conversation or worried about what's going to happen with the industry or the consumption once it's legal. It's how are you going to integrate thousands of people that are already in the marijuana business but are completely co-opted by illegal gangs and illegal entrepreneurs that are completely incapable of, play by the rules. So we do have a very different conversation. Colombia has the same conversation. What about the growers? What about the people that are already there, involved in this, and have absolutely no option of, being in touch with the legal market that can also provide benefits such as access to credit, to infrastructure, to social services, social security, because they are now working effectively for an industry that doesn't provide any of this.
Jonathan, I want you to argue against type a little bit. So one of the things you're very articulate about is the various public health concerns around increased cannabis consumption. Yet it seems possible that there might be significant public health benefits as well. So if you're looking at the last year or two, we've seen a far greater recognition of the number of deaths associated with opioid abuse and what have you. And there is an argument that one hears from advocates of marijuana legalization that if you had marijuana more readily available, that perhaps you wouldn't have seen this diversion to drugs that are arguably far more dangerous, far more addictive, and that have led to a sharp increase in drug overdoses and what have you. So what do you make of that? So tell us a little bit about the potential public health benefits.
Yeah, it's a really good point. The indirect effects on use of other substances could be more important for a final market country like the United States than any of the direct effects. In the Vermont report, we really tried to lay this out. We had a 2x2 table and said in one corner it's alcohol, where there are a lot of studies, but they divide 50-50 on whether greater marijuana use will lead to more or less alcohol abuse. And then there's tobacco, where there are a lot of studies and they're discouraging. But then for opioids, you're right. It's not that there are a large number of studies. There are only a small number of studies, but they are really potentially very encouraging that when marijuana is available to treat pain, people may use fewer of the opioids. And there's two possible stories here. One is they get fewer prescriptions because they're medicating themselves. The other is that it undercuts the overall market, including the diverted opioids. And that would be huge because the opioids are killing like 15,000 people a year. So yeah, that's one of the things that could be a really big upside with legalization if these, I guess it's really 3 studies at this point, are borne out in the long run.
Rob, I have a somewhat unconventional question for you. When I look at the discourse around commercialization of marijuana, one concern I see emerging is that many of the entrepreneurs in this space, they are not from underrepresented communities, yet many of the people who've been caught up in the net of the criminal justice system by virtue of their use or their role in the sale of cannabis are from underrepresented minorities, particularly African Americans and Latinos. So as someone who is pretty close to the emerging cannabis industry, I wonder what you make of that concern. Is it valid? Are there ways that different regulatory regimes around cannabis might encourage more entrepreneurship of the grassroots variety? Just some thoughts about that if you could.
Yeah, it is a kind of a tricky issue because we don't want to be in the business of trying to solve all the world's problems, so we're just trying to legalize marijuana, which is difficult enough. When we start trying to talk about racial equality in terms of who owns these businesses, that's so difficult to even comprehend how we go about doing that. But what we have tried to do, at least on the margins, is to say that if an applicant for a marijuana business license is somehow going to serve communities that have been most harmed by prohibition, that they get some extra points when they're applying for the license. So we don't have a quota system. We're not going to engage in affirmative action, whatever that would look like. But we have at least taken a look at least trying to level the playing field a little in terms of who owns these businesses. More importantly, one thing that we are very serious about is making sure that someone who has been convicted of a marijuana felony could still actually get a job in a legitimate marijuana industry and not be banned for life. Because what will end up happening, if for no other reason, of course it'd be fair to let people actually get involved in the industry after suffering with an arrest or jail or whatever happens to them. But also, there are folks who, if we actually prohibit a huge number of people from getting involved in the legal marijuana industry because of a previous conviction, they might actually then still continue selling marijuana illegally, and then we have the underground criminal market existing. So we want to get those people out of the shadows and into the light.
Well, that's a kind of quick follow-up on that. So if one's concern about the status quo when it comes to marijuana is the affront to personal liberty, or if that's part of one's concern, it seems as though allowing non-commercial legalization, allowing for the emergence of non-commercial co-ops, etc., might actually address a big part of the personal liberty concern, number one. And number two, I guess one could argue that when it comes to the kind of grassroots entrepreneurship by African Americans, Latinos, etc., it might create more opportunities to have a more fragmented marketplace than to have really large-scale commercial producers, venture capital-backed companies, etc., where you might not have that kind of grassroots entrepreneurship. So what do you think about that argument?
Yeah, that kind of resonates with me. There's some folks in DC which is where I live, and they're engaged in trying to formulate what legalization will look like within the District of Columbia on the local level. And they met with me in my office recently, and they said, when it comes time to actually putting the final tweaks on the legalization bill that surely the City Council and the Mayor will enact at some point in the next couple of years, can we at least have it set up so that the industry is fragmented enough so that folks in Ward 7 and Wards 8, which are the concentration of racial minorities in DC, so that they can actually start businesses and not just have it be 2 or 3 big Budweiser companies. And there are easy ways to do that, in terms of limiting the number of licenses or increasing the number of licenses and maximizing or minimizing the number of plants that you can grow with each license. And these are the games that we're currently playing when we're drafting these initiatives. And by the way, with regard to the industry drafting this stuff, we do actually ask the industry players for input, as well as other folks like criminal defense lawyers and occasionally law enforcement and certainly medical marijuana patients, but we ultimately are the ones that draft these initiatives. So if you don't like the drafting, I think you should blame the Marijuana Policy Project and not the industry folks.
And Jonathan, I think you were...
I was just going to say, I absolutely agree with the idea that you're going to create a lot more middle-class jobs if you leave it as an artisanal industry. And unless you take proactive steps, it's not going to be that small artisanal industry. Rob, you said it was going to be easy to do that. It's relatively easy to do that when it's prohibited by the federal government. After it's legal nationally, the capacity of a state to block the product of what's produced in another state is severely limited by the Interstate Commerce Clause. And there can be a race to the bottom where one state says, we will happily create an industry-friendly regime. So the capacity of the other states to protect their artisanal middle-class jobs will be greatly reduced after the federal prohibition disappears.
Well, Kevin, I have a quick question for you. So William F. Buckley Jr. had a kind of quirky position on marijuana legalization. His view is that it should be legalized, but that the federal government should establish retail stores that sell marijuana and a variety of other narcotics, and that it would tightly control the system. Now, when it comes to some of the concerns that you've raised, and just about making the product more attractive and what have you, it seems as though having a kind of government monopoly over the sale of narcotics might address some of those concerns. I wonder what you think about that idea, and if the problem with the idea from your perspective is that it's still destigmatizing the use of a drug that you consider dangerous.
Well, obviously, I think it would be better if that were the case.
Better than the status quo, or
better than the commercial market for legalism. No, I don't think it would be better than the status quo. I think it would be better. I think what would be better than the status quo is a version where you would reduce criminal penalties, not allow any kind of open sales and discourage, which necessarily then does not allow advertising and promotion. But in the states where we've had alcohol monopolies, we still have an alcohol problem, and we still have industries, and we still have commercialization and promotion. But that's not the reason I don't think that the government monopoly is better than the status quo. It's not the relevant discussion point in any of these states. And we could say, well, Kevin, why don't you make it that relevant point? Or John or others, why don't you make it? Well, again, we don't have the people with multiple zeros at the end of the bank accounts helping us draft any of this stuff. And so when you see what you see in the way, again, that these initiatives are being written, it just makes this discussion less and less relevant. And I do want to go back to the point about racial minorities. I mean, when we look at the fact that in this country there are, in most big cities like Baltimore and Chicago, There are 8 times as many liquor stores in poorer, marginalized communities, mainly communities of color, than there are in upper-class communities. When we see that there are already barriers to entry for employment, I don't see how, by sort of saying, well, by allowing legal stores in Ward 7 or Ward 8, how a Latino kid who already can't get a job because he's racially discriminated against, is that an employer is going to say, oh, well, you're using marijuana, or you're in marijuana business, well, that makes you more employable for me. I mean, I just don't see how overall this helps the plight of those who have problems that go beyond, drug convictions, that go to institutional racism, in our society. And that's why you saw someone like Michelle Alexander actively oppose the Ohio initiative last November. Someone who you cannot find a bigger critic of the war on drugs than somebody, but who has actually been paring back her criticism, not that she's in favor of the war on drugs, but paring back, let's say, her enthusiasm for legalization because of the effects it can have on minority communities, on marginalized communities. So, the only people really that were in opposition in D.C. were the churches in Ward 7 and Ward 8, while the white guys at Georgetown, who were the pro-legalization bloggers, all of a sudden became civil rights activists, saying we need to do this as a civil rights issue. Or you actually had a lot of the people in the black churches that don't have a lot of money who were extremely concerned with how another industry is going to exploit and expose them. So I think that's a side of this that we don't talk about a lot.
I wonder if any of the panelists have questions for the other panelists. Anything that has come up over the course of the conversation. Anyone who wants to get started. Rob, do you have anything you'd like to raise with your co-panelists?
Well, the one area where there might be a great deal of common ground is decriminalization. And so I guess the question is, maybe for Kevin, is can you see a scenario where we have a bill to decriminalize marijuana possession with no industry involved at all, such as the bills that we're currently working on in New Hampshire and Illinois? Is there a way that we can work together to decriminalize marijuana possession as you see it?
Well, I think, again, the devil's in the details. And, I personally think that, cannabis use disorder is serious and that they're underdiagnosed, and we need to be able to do assessments and see if somebody actually needs a brief intervention or needs treatment. And if we can couple that with a kind of decriminalization law, I think that there's room. But I think the reason we haven't been, running over to your offices and making a deal on some of this stuff in those states is because what we've seen in a lot of places, just like we saw with medical marijuana, is that that these are often just stalking horses to greater, issues that we wouldn't agree with. And so, like in Vermont, I remember 2 or 3 years ago when Patrick and I went to Vermont State House, they were debating decriminalization in 2013. And I remember Governor Shindlin looking Patrick, he's a big fan of Congressman Kennedy, looking him in the eye and was there saying, but Congressman, this is decriminalization. I'm not in favor of legalization, and that's not what this is. And versus compelling. Of course, 1 year later, he's using his state address to call, for legalization. So I think it's, would have to be in a certain scenario. I don't exit out, but I would hope that if that happened, you also could team up with us to limit industry influence in Colorado and Washington, to make sure that tax money did go to education, and to make sure we would have reasonable limits on an industry, at least in Colorado, that is acting with the community, with the advertising and commercialization. So I'd like to see it go both ways.
Would anyone else like to jump in with a question for a fellow panelist?
I'll ask Rob. Why not favor legalization but giving the industry to nonprofit organizations rather than for-profit, and charging them explicitly with meeting existing demand but not acting in ways that promote greater demand and consumption? Why don't you support that model?
So, I try to view the public policies that we draft through some kind of rational prism. And so with alcohol being more harmful to the individual user as well as to society, it doesn't seem intuitive to me that we want to actually clamp down more on marijuana than on alcohol. So if you wanted to say, well, if it'd be better to have marijuana regulated and sold through a nonprofit system, then I would have to reverse it and say, well, should we also do the same thing with alcohol? Because what we don't want is to actually have marijuana more restricted than alcohol.
On
answer is, if we didn't already have those companies, sure, I'd rather have it be nonprofits. That is, if it were 1933, then I would have preferred that the industry not be created. But there are billions of dollars in people's value and jobs that you can't just wipe out.
Lisa, I wonder, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering for the three panelists here that are so very, they're very savvy of what's happening in the US and experts in the topic. What do you think is the next frontier of drug policy reform in the States, given that the cannabis discussion, I mean, whether we like how the models are unfolding or not, is kind of won already. And I see that people here, even in the audience, there's this feeling of it's inevitable, cannabis will be legalized at some point, it's just a matter of time. What's the next frontier of drug policy reform in the States?
Well, without buying that it's inevitable, because I might be in the minority, but I don't think that. I think it's a great question because not necessarily MPP, which is very issue specific as is SAM, but when you look at the people who have been pushing this for longer than MPP and more broader, I mean, it's clearly the legalization of all drugs, and I think that's a very important discussion to have because I think that if that's really what is behind this and it doesn't really stop the legalization of marijuana, I think the public deserves to know that. The public deserves to know where your public budget campaign. In fact, my question I was going to turn to you. It's maybe later. It was going to be about for your group in Mexico. I mean, you sort of hinted that cannabis really isn't where the ball is at. So I'd like to know maybe after we answer what would be the ultimate goal, because I see these conflating of issues a lot of we want to end the war on drugs, like the letter that Drug Policy Alliance got Tom Brady and some other people to sign. Let's end the war on drugs, but okay, well, what specifically does that mean? I mean, we see this with President Peña Nieto in Mexico, we see this in Colombia, we see a lot of rhetoric about how the war on drugs has been horrible and destructive and awful, but then, so is it embracing legalization? Sometimes it's the opposite. In Ecuador, from what I've seen, domestic policies are getting much harsher. In fact, in a lot of South America, we see an increase in mandatory minimums. Although on the international stage, there's this America has been this imperialistic leader of the drug war, which has been horrible. So I'd like to hear from you, that distinction between what does end the war on drugs look like? Because we hear the bumper sticker, but not the meat of the discussion point maybe after.
Well, Lisa, perhaps you want to take that and then we'll revisit.
Sure. Well, for us, it's very clear. For us, as I said at the very beginning, it's a comprehensive policy. We in Mexico work very actively into advocating for legal regulation, but we also have regular meetings with the people from the health authorities as to say, what are we going to do in terms of providing services? How do we stop this temptation of going for mandatory treatment? How do we deal with this horrible system of the drug courts that, by the way, are very supported and funded by the U.S.? It's not that we say that this is a rhetoric of the U.S. being terrible. It's actively funded by the U.S. and not only in Mexico, in Latin America, all across Latin America.
For those who are not familiar with Mexico's drug courts as to why you find them so terrible, just briefly.
Yes, because they in Mexico they sell this idea that there were a lot of people that were already involved in some sort of troubles with the criminal justice system that got in touch with it because they committed a felony, they robbed, whatever gets you, under the influence of drugs. And because the levels of recidivism were much higher of the people that were using drugs into committing another crime or another felony, you better had special tribunals for them as to provide them with treatment so they wouldn't go in touch with the criminal justice system again. The problem is that so far we only have 5 states with such tribunals, and the numbers are not necessarily getting to where they originally wanted to get, which was reducing misuse of drugs and also reducing criminal activity. Because there are mostly people that get there because of their abuse on alcohol rather than illegal drugs. The second thing is that most of the crimes committed don't come with all of the necessary measures. For example, it's domestic violence. They get there for alcohol abuse and domestic violence. But no one's doing anything to protect the victims of domestic violence. And then the worst part is, if you fail at completing an abstinence-based treatment, the criminal procedure reactivates itself, so the people ends up being again in jail, in trouble with the law, for failing such treatment, when there is no serious effort coming from the Mexican government as to provide effective treatment. It's like they tell you, they mandate judiciary that you go to treatment, but they don't offer you a real place in which you can actually get some good quality treatment. So you're making it mandatory, you're forcing people into some places that are horrible, that commit a lot of human rights abuses, and then you sanction them again for failing into such treatment. And this is a project that has been exported into Chile and some other Latin American countries through the OAS mechanism, by the way, which I believe is terrible. But coming back to your question, we do believe that it doesn't end in cannabis legalization, definitely, but that there are very different models and ways of regulating the other substances. For Mexico, ending the war on drugs implies reforming the criminal justice system, involves a lot of work with the police forces, involves a lot of work with the human rights commissions, but also involves a lot of work on poppy. We do have a lot of problems with the farmers that are involved in the poppy cultivation. We do have very, very strong criminal gangs that are controlling specific territories that are dedicated to that. We also have a lot of local dynamics going on into producing other types of drugs. So for us, it implies ending the war on drugs. It's a reform of our laws as to making less criminalizing for the people that are just using or possessing. But it's also thinking beyond that box and saying, what are we going to do with something that's real? These production exists. These farmers exist, they have rights, it's a development discussion, and you're going to see it. Mexico's intervention next week at the UNGAS is going to be pretty much based on what's the development approach to drug policy for the years to come. And it's also about strengthening our health system and integrating the state services, because most of the people that get punished for drug offenses are marginal people that had no access before even getting in touch with the illegal economy of drugs to any sort of service. So it's a titanic job, but it's pretty much where we're heading.
We have very limited time now, so I wanted to ask a question, and I'm hoping for relatively brief answers for the three Americans on the panel. Just regarding, what is your wish list for what the federal government ought to do? When we're looking at the changes in the regulation of marijuana, we've seen pretty much all of the action at the state level. And I wonder, for you, Rob, what would be your top priority for federal legislation?
The top priority is to change federal laws so that states can determine their own marijuana policies without interference. John, like alcohol.
My priority is the exact opposite. My priority is that the federal government put a floor underneath what is permitted, not cede completely to the states. And specifically, I would like the federal government to say, for-profit businesses cannot participate in this industry. Non-profits, okay.
Well, quick question for you both. So, do you believe that this is essential? This is really important? Because I guess for you, Rob, the Marijuana Policy Project has achieved a huge number of victories in terms of changing public opinion, just purely by going at the state level. Do you actually see it as really, really important that you see federal legislation in the next, say, 3 to 4 years? Or do you think that it's more of a nice to have than an essential?
So it's more important to change more state laws than it is to change federal law, perhaps in the near term, but really they go hand in hand, and so it's kind of tough to really argue one without the other. The key thing, though, is, yes, it is essential to ultimately change federal law, because right now, any of these individuals or businesses that are engaged with marijuana, whether it's medical marijuana, whether it's possession of marijuana, whether it's sale, large-scale cultivation, everything is illegal under federal law. And so we are a nation of lawbreakers, and we want to remove the federal prohibition to actually allow adults to be legal if they're engaged in behaviors that are, nonviolent and abiding by state law.
I imagine you feel differently. Do you see federal legislation as a really important step towards putting a brake on some of these experiments we've been seeing that are...
Short answer is yes. I don't think it's a good thing when state and federal law conflicts. So I would like the federal government to ban for-profit businesses, to not ban possession and use, and so there not to be a disagreement between state and federal.
Kevin?
I agree with that, sensible reforms in terms of housing and higher education, but to enforce the law and to make sure that, right now the different laws to actually enforce that. But also an important topic we didn't mention related to this is to get the federal government in the business of separating the medical marijuana discussion from the discussion on legalization. Let's treat this like any other medicine that's researched, prescribed by doctors, and dispensed at pharmacies, and done so in a way that, you know, is safe and effective. Now, if it may take a long time to do some research, let's have a compassionate access program like we did with Marinol. For 4 years, thousands of people got Marinol before it was FDA approved in the 1980s through a very simple mechanism through NIH. We should do that now. If there are kids with Dravet's or other kinds of you know, epilepsy disorders, we should allow CBD-based medications that are currently being researched to be dispensed under tight controls with the FDA, rather than right now this Wild West that we have with CBD with kids and also these THC products that nobody's looking into at all. So I'd have the federal government do sensible research and compassionate access programs for those with a true medical need, if we want to really call it medicine, but to enforce the Controlled Substances Act or change it. I mean, at least, right, be consistent. I hope they don't change it, though, because I don't think the federal government can do a thing when this is treated like alcohol and tobacco, just like they haven't been able to with alcohol. And the only reason with tobacco is because they've been voluntary bans after the Master Settlement Agreement. I don't want to have to wait 100 years for another Master Settlement Agreement when folks come together and say, oh yeah, wait a minute, this industry was lying to us. It was trying to, you know, give us kid-friendly products. It was funding its own research. It's doing all of that now. So I don't want to see that. I don't want to see where we were in '99 with tobacco in 2019 with cannabis. I'd rather prevent that from happening.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thanks to you in the audience for providing such wonderful questions. I hope that I did them justice.